Hello everybody. Today we're going to move into adolescence and start by discussing the physical development that happens in adolescence. But before we can really start that, we need to know what is adolescence. And adolescence is a developmental stage that lies between childhood and adulthood. Adolescence is getting longer due to early biological maturation, which we'll talk about, that people are maturing earlier, and the extended time that individuals remain dependent on their parents. Now, adolescence has a long age range. Think about from 10 years old to 20 years old, which is quite a bit of time. And if you think about the difference between a 10-year-old and a 20-year-old, it is a huge difference. And so we can break adolescence up into different categories of early adolescence, about 10 to 13 years old, middle adolescence, 14 to 17, and then later adolescence, 18 to 22. You can really think how different the developmental stages of, again, a 10-year-old compared to a 22-year-old, right? There's a huge amount of development that goes on throughout adolescence. So during adolescence and physical development, we talk about puberty, which is this period of the lifespan where an individual becomes capable of sexual reproduction. Puberty begins at about age 11 or 12 for girls and 13 or 14 for boys. This is regulated by the endocrine system and the hormones that are released during this time that then lead to physical changes. It's interesting that no new hormones are produced, no new bodily systems develop at puberty. It's just the amount of hormones that change at this time. So puberty involves these hormonal and physical changes that contribute to sexual maturity and to adult height. Hormones are these body chemicals that regulate all sorts of things like hunger, sleep, stress, sexual desire, reproduction, moods, and puberty. Going through puberty takes an average of 5 years, and you can again see the difference between fourth graders, 10, 11 years old, and then high school juniors, 16 years old, and through that time, these individuals have gone through puberty. I think nobody says it better than adolescents themselves, so here are a few quotes about going through the physical changes that accompany puberty. Anne, who was age 14, can't stand the way I look. I have zits all over my face. My hair is dull and stringy. It never stays in place. My nose is too big. My lips are too small. My legs are too short. My body is a disaster. And here's Angie, age 13. I don't like my breasts. They're too small and they look funny. I'm afraid guys won't like me if they don't get bigger. Middle school, right? This is a tough time. And here's Jim, age 14. I'm short and I can't stand it. My father is 6 feet tall, and here I am only 5 feet 4 inches tall. I'm 14 already. I look like a kid, and I get teased a lot, especially by other guys. I'm always the last one picked for sides in basketball because I'm so short. Girls don't seem to be interested in me either because most of them are taller than I am. This is such a difficult, or can be such a difficult time. So the 4 major changes that happen physically during puberty, there's the development of primary sexual characteristics, which are body changes that directly involve reproduction, such as the growth of the penis for boys and testes, growth of the uterus, maturation of the ovaries, menstruation for girls. And then we have the development of secondary sexual characteristics, which are physical body changes not directly involved in reproduction, such as breast development, pubic hair, voice changes, etc. And then we have the adolescent growth spurt, which we'll talk about, and changes in body composition. Interestingly, there's a declining age of the onset of puberty. Call that the secular trend of in puberty. So in the 1860s in Europe, the average age that females began menstruation was over 17 years old. In the 1960s, that dropped to under 13. And today, before 13 is quite common. And you can see average age here, first menstruation, and there's this trend toward younger and younger ages. It also seems to be related to the nation's economic development. And you can see with a higher kind of socioeconomic status of countries, we're getting a lower age of puberty. So the hormonal programmers, two systems, two different command centers that are working on the hormone release that is important for puberty. We have the adrenal androgens that are produced by the adrenal glands. And so this is testosterone and estrogen that are being produced. And they program aspects of puberty like the growth of hair, influence of skin changes, sexual desire. Testosterone and other androgens are responsible for sexual arousal in males and females. Women produce mainly estrogens. Testosterone is 8 times higher in boys after puberty than before, so there's a large increase in testosterone. Androgens begin secretion in middle childhood and peaks in the early 20s. And then the second system is this HPG axis. That's the hypothalamus, right, which is in your brain, right here. And then pituitary gland, right here. And then gonad for males and females over here. And this is the main hormonal system that really programs puberty. The hypothalamus triggers the pituitary gland, right? Sends a message to the pituitary gland to secrete its hormones, which in turn then trigger the gonads to secrete their hormones, estrogen and testosterone, which produce major body changes. And so both of these systems are working throughout puberty. The adolescent growth spurt, so that's another physical change that we see during puberty. Kind of like this chart here. Here's age and height gain. And so you can see that there's quite a large amount of height gain in infancy, right? Children are getting bigger and bigger. And then over time that gain of height or length slows down, right, until we're right over the first 2 years. Children are, although it's declining, children are really gaining many centimeters per year. Slows down during childhood, middle childhood, and then we get this peak again, this increase in growth at puberty. And what's important to notice here is girls have their growth spurt before boys, right? Girls have their growth spurt around 12 years old, boys more common around 14. And this is a general estimate, right? There's a range of variability, certainly. But you see this increase in growth again, and then again after puberty it declines until we're at adult height. Another major physical change during puberty is changes in body composition. The relative proportion of body fat to muscle changes. In females, body fat increases relative to muscle, and for boys, they're gaining more muscle. And of course, particularly for girls, although we'll talk about this with boys too, girls at this point, they're gaining more fat, which is a natural part of going through puberty. But it's just at this time they're becoming more aware of body image, aware of media images of kind of the ideal body, and their bodies are starting to look less and less like that ideal, which can certainly lead to self-esteem issues, eating disorders, etc. And here we've got puberty timetables. There are many individual differences. You can take a look at this in your book as well in terms of what's happening at different ages for girls and boys. what's the immediate impact of puberty? Well, we see adolescent moodiness, and parents and caregivers and teachers may say, oh, what's, the stereotypical teenager? They're very moody and it must be because of all the hormones. What is the research on that? Well, are adolescents more moody? They do have more fluctuations of their mood during the day than adults. So they go from happy to sad to angry more rapidly and more times throughout the day than adults. But this is not solely due to hormones. That's sort of the stereotypical, they're being hormonal, it's the hormones that are causing them to act this way. But really that's not true. When you think about adolescence, there is a lot that adolescents are going through in terms of their body changes, the pressures at school, peers and friends, significant others, thinking about college, after school activities. There's so much going on that it would be enough to make anybody moody. And that's what the research shows, that it's not just hormones. There are many stressors that are making adolescence and contributing to adolescence moodiness. Also, we see changes in patterns of sleep. We say that adolescents have a delayed phase preference and later melatonin secretion. Well, what does that mean? Melatonin is a chemical that's released in your brain. It's naturally released about a couple of hours before you fall asleep. So if you're usually falling asleep around 10 o'clock at night, around 8 o'clock, melatonin starts to be released, and it sort of triggers your brain to start to become tired and be ready for bed. What happens in adolescence is this melatonin is released later. So instead of being released, let's say at 8 o'clock at night, it's being released at 10 o'clock at night. And then that's triggering you to get tired later. And if you're tired later, of course, sleep longer and then want to wake up later. So it's this entire kind of phase delay of sleep compared to what children have as their sleep cycle. So number one, research does show that this is biological, right? Melatonin release has nothing to do with necessarily anybody's choice. So there is that, as well as leading to adolescents staying up later, environmental influences, right? We've got televisions and cell phones and computers and things that adolescents tend to like to do late into the night. And then this really has a very interesting effect on school start times and question about what we should do about school start times, particularly for high schoolers, because what we're finding is that adolescents go to sleep much later. They still have to wake up very early to get to school. I don't know if you remember what time your high school started. I remember mine started at 7:30. And so adolescents are constantly sleep deprived. And there's been research to show that first period, second period, most adolescents aren't able to learn as effectively because they're still tired. They're still sleepy, right? Due to this delayed sleep phase cycle. And so the question is, well, should we start high school later? Should high school start at 10 o'clock? So adolescents can fall asleep later, wake up later, go to school and be able to learn. Of course, that leads to other questions, right? If school starts later, it ends later, it ends at 5 o'clock. What do you do about after school activities? What about parents who work and can't get their children to school at 10 o'clock in the morning? They have to get them there earlier. What about younger siblings, etc.? But it's a pretty interesting question that research is really starting to impact public policy. Psychosocial impact of puberty. Most adolescents react positively to these pubertal changes. So even though, again, there's this stereotype that adolescents, this is so difficult, truly most adolescents go through puberty just fine. And in fact, they are happy with their new bodies, particularly the secondary sexual characteristics. They feel proud of, the new person that they are becoming. And so that is good to know. So the basic principles of puberty, the changes are exciting, sometimes can be frightening, right? Any kind of change, and particularly as it's going on in your body, people, adolescents will look at themselves and almost not recognize themselves sometimes because so many changes are occurring. The reactions depend on social norms and reactions of individual family members, right? So if parents are saying, oh, this is, amazing, and they're excited about it, you'll see the adolescent be excited about these puberty changes. If you've got family members who are sad about it or feeling like, they're not happy about these changes, the adolescent might then internalize those feelings as well. Again, and you can look at just different breast development in Western culture often equals pride, and so you might see, again, a more positive impact on the adolescent in Western culture as breasts are developing. Menstruation, again, there's varying responses in terms of feeling ambivalent, disgusted, or just fine with it. There's a tendency to be secretive about first ejaculation in males. So there's all sorts of different approaches and reactions to these physical changes of puberty. What about the timing of puberty, early or late maturation? So let's talk about boys first. For early maturing boys, the pros of being an early maturing boy, meaning going through puberty earlier than your peers, they tend to be more popular and have better self-esteem. They tend to be more responsible, cooperative, sociable later in adulthood. And again, these are correlations. This isn't a causal or cause and effect, but this is what we tend to see with early maturing boys. The cons of being an early maturing boy: more drug and alcohol use, and you see earlier sexual activity. What about late maturation for boys? So a boy who matures later than typical, goes through puberty later than average. In that case, you see more anxiety, depression. Girls are less attracted to them. Remember, they're still looking more like a child for longer. Coaches less often want them on their teams. They might get bullied or teased, and they may start to act in ways that are unhealthy. They may start clowning around, becoming more socially isolated. Remember, so a late maturing boy, basically the rest of the group has already gone through puberty, and so this adolescent feels very different, looks very different. And so during adolescence, being different is often difficult. What about with girls? So compared to early maturing boys, early maturing girls have more difficulties. So I'm going to say pros of early maturation, and there's a big question mark there. They're more popular with the boys because they are going through puberty at an earlier stage. Boys are more interested in them. I don't know if that's a pro or a con, but the cons of early maturation, remember, girls mature earlier than boys anyway, so an early maturing girl is really very different from their peers, right? Because first girls go through puberty, then boys. So if you're an early maturing girl, you are looking very different from the rest of your peers. And so they're often teased by peers. They have to fit into smaller chairs at school, right? If they're going through their growth spurt earlier and they're getting to be an adult size, but they're still in, a fourth grade or fifth grade chair. They might be ashamed of their body changes and hide under oversized clothes. They tend to be heavier. Early maturing girls tend to be heavier and shorter in stature later in life. Lowered self-image, higher rates of depression, eating disorders, anxiety. And we do see precocious or early sexual activity with older boyfriends, increased rate of drug and alcohol use, more likely to enter abusive relationships, maybe because they're younger and so their social judgment is still immature. So, whereas boys who mature early tend to fare better, early maturation in girls tend to come with more negative implications. Overweight in early puberty, in terms of the girls, childhood weight predicts when a girl physically matures and is linked to rapid weight gain during the first months of life and a high body mass index in elementary school. Data, however, are much more inconsistent for boys. So how to minimize puberty distress in terms of the child's reaction to going through all of these physical changes, making an effort to communicate about the changes that are happening in puberty with the same-sex child is often very helpful. You can discuss what's going on, describe as a parent or a caregiver your own experiences, and help children get involved in positive activities. Kind of focus on something positive, not just on all of the changes that are happening. This is the first time we start to see a significant increase in body image issues in adolescents. And so Hartner's research talked about feelings of competence in 5 domains that are related to overall self-esteem. And so the research discusses scholastic competence, behavioral conduct, athletic skills, peer likability, and appearance. And for adolescents, contentment with one's appearance outweighs any other categories. This is more for girls than for boys, but certainly applies to both sexes. And so this is also the time where eating disorders start to increase. So eating disorders or disordered eatings are patterns of eating, attitudes about eating and food, and behaviors that are unhealthy. Eating disorders are correlated with body dissatisfaction, right? We said that puberty brings upon a rapid increase in body fat for girls, and there's a higher dissatisfaction among early maturing girls with their bodies because their bodies are changing, they're gaining these higher proportions of fat, and they're looking much different than their peers, and again, these media idealized images. Interestingly, and we've talked about this before, the most common eating or weight issue among adolescents is actually obesity. Eating disorders may come from a deviation from the ideal physique, and ideal again is in quotes there, that can lead to a loss of self-esteem and other problems in the adolescent's self-image. There really is, particularly in Western United States, culture a very thin ideal and pressure to be abnormally thin. Overweight and even underweight female teens felt they were too fat. There is body dissatisfaction in males too. Males tend to want to build up muscles and feel they are not muscular enough to meet the ideal. There was studies of magazines from 1970 to 1990 where the ideal body shape became much slimmer and less curvaceous. And again, during adolescence, what's happening in girls, they're becoming more curvy, gaining more fat. This is all normal, but they're looking farther and farther from those media images. And now with digitally manipulated images, these magazine images that adolescents see are even more realistic or even impossible to obtain. All right, we're going to watch, let me pause it for a second. I'm going to watch this. Is a interesting, it's a commercial from Dove, but it's very interesting about body dissatisfaction, and that these are adults, you'll see themselves very differently than other people see them. And we see this phenomenon even more so in adolescence. So we'll go ahead and watch this.
Forensic artist, worked for the San Jose Police Department from 1995 to 2011.
I showed up to a place I'd never been, and there was a guy with a drafting board.
We couldn't see them, they couldn't see us.
Tell me about your hair.
I didn't know what he was doing, but then I could tell after several questions that he was drawing me.
Tell me about your chin.
It kind of protrudes a little bit, especially when I smile.
Your jaw.
My mom told me I had a big jaw.
What would be your most prominent feature?
Kind of have a fat, rounder face.
The older I've gotten, the more freckles I've gotten.
I would say I have a pretty big forehead.
Once I get a sketch, I say thank you very much, and then they leave. I don't see them.
All I had been told before the sketch was to get friendly with this other woman, Chloe.
Today I'm going to ask you some questions about a person you met earlier, and I'm going to ask you some general questions about their face.
She was thin, so you could see her cheekbones. And her chin, it was a nice, thin chin.
She had nice eyes. They lit up when she spoke.
Cute nose.
She had blue eyes, very nice blue eyes.
So here we are. This is the sketch that you helped me create, and that's a sketch that somebody described of you.
So yeah, that's...
She looks closed off and fatter, sadder too. The second one looks more open, friendly, and happy.
I should be more grateful of my natural beauty. It impacts the choices and the friends that we make, the jobs we apply for, how we treat our children. It impacts everything.
Okay,
Couldn't be more critical to your happiness.
Do you think you're more beautiful than you say?
Yeah.
But this brings us to the idea that
We spend a lot of time as women
adults,
analyzing and trying to fix the thing.
Have distorted body images. And those with eating disorders have extremely distorted body images. Where you show them their themselves in a mirror, and even if they're extremely thin, you can see bones, protruding because they aren't eating. They'll still say, I'm overweight, I'm too fat. They don't see themselves the way that they truly are. And the more distorted the body image, perhaps the more likely that someone would be engaging in an eating disorder. We'll talk about two very briefly because we could talk about these for a long time, but we're just going to bring up anorexia nervosa as one of the eating disorders, characterized by self-starvation, and you have to be 85% or less of a healthy body weight to be diagnosed with anorexia. Not eating is very dangerous and can destroy body organs and cause death. There are many medical emergencies in individuals with anorexia that require hospitalization. In order to be diagnosed with anorexia, in women, menstruation has to stop. And again, these individuals have distorted body images. Another eating disorder is bulimia nervosa. This is characterized by at least biweekly cycles of binging and purging. So Binging is eating a very large amount of food, more food than would be typical in a specific time frame than a typical person would eat. And then purging means getting rid of the food and the calories in some way. That can be vomiting, taking laxatives, fasting, excess exercise, etc. There are major health consequences to bulimia, including mouth sores, loss of tooth enamel, esophageal ulcers, esophageal cancer. Bulimia and anorexia are 10 times more common among females than males, but they do occur in males. And there's actually a lot more research now going on regarding males and eating disorders. What causes these conditions? So there seems to be a strong hereditary component, genes, particularly in girls. We see temperamental tendencies in individuals with eating disorders to be more anxious, to have lower self-efficacy, to have a greater need for approval, and an inability to express their needs. So interventions in terms of improving teenagers' body image, we can target at-risk girls who are prone to depression and low self-worth and subscribe to this thin ideal, and focus on elevating self-efficacy and promoting their self-esteem. Exploring sexual desire at this age, along with physical changes, primary and secondary sex characteristics. There's lots of flirting, hand-holding. This is what's beginning in adolescence. And there's this interplay of nature and nurture going on that heightens these sex hormonal levels. Nature is going on, so puberty is naturally increasing sex hormones at this time. And nurture, there's culture that's shaping thoughts into fantasies, obsessions, sexual contact, etc. And so both are really working at this time. Is there a sexual double standard, a cultural code that gives men greater sexual freedom than women? There's a stereotype that suggests boys want sex, girls want more of a committed relationships, boys are more insistent, girls are more hesitant. These are stereotypes. In many countries, including the United States, rates of sexual activity are almost even for boys and girls, which is interesting. Trends among adolescents in sexual activity. Interestingly, each cohort or each group, remember, that is born around the same time is less sexually active than the previous cohort. They've been following this for many years, from 1991 to 2015. More teenagers worldwide are virgins than a decade ago. Teen births have decreased. Use of birth control, particularly condoms, has increased. Teen abortion rate is down. Maybe better sex education, right? Fear of HIV/AIDS, better realization and understanding of difficulties with pregnancy, better understanding of abortion. All of this may be leading to the changes that we're seeing. However, U.S. adolescent pregnancy is the highest of any developed nation. So even though we're on the decline, in the United States, it's still higher than other developed nations. What about early adolescent sexual activity? That tends to be correlated with depression, drug abuse, early sex, if that leads to pregnancy and birth. Most teenage girls have no partners to help, and certainly raising a child is complex and expensive, and often family help isn't available. Also, sexually transmitted infections are more common in early adolescent sexual activity, so definitely something to be aware of. In terms of teenager-friendly sex education, parents are often divided about what to say to teens about sex. Depending on religion, morals, ethnicity, some might only want their child to learn about abstinence. Some are afraid that teaching about contraception may actually encourage teens to have sexual intercourse, and research has shown that is not true. Teens report the irrelevance of high school sex education, and perhaps a more effective approach would be romance or relationship classes to sort of teach about the whole relationship process as opposed to just being focused on sex. I think probably many people could benefit from perhaps a romance or relationship class. And who would teach it? All right. Thank you very much, everybody.